Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Because time matters here. Not as a countdown, but as a threshold. One we cross simply by turning our attention toward the subject. This episode examines a class of beings found across the history of cosmic horror. Entities that feed not on blood or flesh or fear, but on thought itself. To speak of them, to even think about them, is already to participate. That's not metaphor. That's the mechanism. The idea that thought can be consumed, extracted, distorted, or undone appears far earlier than Lovecraft. We find it in Gnostic cosmologies, where false gods feed on ignorance. We find it in Buddhist warnings about attachment, and in Renaissance accounts of madness visited by demonic forces. But in the 20th century, this anxiety begins to mutate. What if knowledge is not power, but bait? This documentary is not a list of creatures. It is a forensic study of a recurring pattern in fiction, myth, and psychology. We'll examine how different authors, Lovecraft, Ligotti, Borges, and others, independently imagined consciousness as a kind of offering. We'll ask what it means to posit entities who do not want our bodies, but our attention, our insight, our minds. More unsettlingly, we'll consider the implications of such entities in a world where cognition is increasingly commodified, externalized, and exposed. Watch carefully. This is not fiction pretending to be real. It is fiction behaving as if it has already noticed you, and in some sense, it has. The idea that consciousness itself might be exploitable emerges alongside moments when human self-understanding undergoes stress. Before the modern period, fear tended to localize in bodies, territories, or divine punishments. By the late 19th century, that focus shifts inward. Advances in neurology, psychiatry, and evolutionary theory reframe the mind as a fragile biological process, rather than a metaphysical constant. This matters. Once thought is treated as contingent and material, it becomes imaginable as something that can be altered, damaged, or consumed. The cosmic entity that feeds on human thought is not an ancient superstition preserved intact, but a modern synthesis born from intellectual destabilization. This shift accelerates between roughly 1880 and 1930, a period marked by industrialization, mass literacy, and unprecedented informational density. Writers operating in this environment confronted a paradox. Human knowledge expanded rapidly, yet confidence in human significance collapsed. Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, displaced humanity from the center of creation. Freud's interpretation of dreams, 1900, displaced conscious intention from the center of the mind. Consider this carefully. Once humans are no longer masters of either nature or themselves, the mind becomes an exposed surface rather than a protected interior. Horror responds by imagining predators adapted to this new vulnerability. H.P. Lovecraft did not invent the idea of thought-feeding entities, but he clarified its logic. Writing primarily in the 1910s and 1920s, Lovecraft treated consciousness as a byproduct of indifferent cosmic forces. His letters repeatedly emphasize that fear arises not from evil intent, but from scale mismatch. Human minds encounter realities they were not shaped to process. The result is collapse. Not physical annihilation, but epistemic failure. Lovecraft's entities do not torture, they overwhelm. They persist whether observed or not, yet observation accelerates harm. This is not sadism, but ecology. The human mind functions as an inadequate environment, exposed to pressures it cannot regulate. Other contemporaneous writers reach similar conclusions through different routes. Algernon Blackwood's stories of vast, impersonal presences frame nature as cognitively hostile. Arthur Machen links hidden truths to psychological disintegration rather than moral corruption. Even early science fiction participates. In works by Olaf Stapledon during the 1930s, cosmic intelligences absorb and discard civilizations without malice or awareness. The convergence is telling. These authors did not collaborate, yet they articulate compatible anxieties. That suggests a shared intellectual climate rather than isolated imagination. The thought-feeding entity becomes a narrative solution to a broader problem: how to represent a universe that renders human cognition incidental. We must pause here to distinguish intent from effect. These writers were not warning readers away from knowledge itself. They were interrogating the assumption that knowledge is inherently stabilizing. In this framework, understanding does not empower, it exposes. The scholar, the dreamer, the archivist become ideal points of contact because they seek coherence. The entity feeds not on ignorance, but on structured attention. This is not anti-intellectualism, but epistemological skepticism. It asks whether the pursuit of total understanding contains its own failure mode. By the mid-20th century, this logic intensifies rather than recedes. The aftermath of World War II, the emergence of nuclear physics, and the abstraction of mathematics into realms without physical intuition further destabilize common-sense reality. Thought becomes increasingly mediated by symbols inaccessible to direct experience. In this context, the idea that cognition could attract hostile forces functions as allegory and speculation simultaneously. Entities that consume thought mirror systems that exploit attention, labor, or belief without requiring individual consent. The horror lies in inevitability, not intent. This historical trajectory establishes the groundwork for what follows. Once thought is framed as vulnerable, older myths resurface in altered form. Religious, philosophical, and cross-cultural precedents are reinterpreted through this modern lens. The next step, then, is not literary invention, but inheritance, tracing how earlier traditions anticipated the possibility that thinking itself might be a liability rather than a safeguard. Long before cosmic horror named them, cultures around the world envisioned entities that act upon human thought, erasing, distorting, feeding, or possessing. These were not always monstrous in form. Often they were divine, ghostly, or incorporeal. What unified them was their relationship to human cognition. They did not kill, they unmade. In Sumerian texts, malevolent Utuku spirits did not drag victims to an underworld, but rather afflicted them with forgetfulness, confusion, or irrational terror. Egyptian funerary texts warn of beings like Amut, whose function was not simple destruction, but the erasure of selfhood through moral imbalance. These were not metaphors for death, but for the loss of coherence, entities that attacked meaning itself. In ancient Greece, the river Lethe offered not peace, but oblivion. To drink from it meant forgetting all previous lives and entering existence again as a blank slate. It is notable that this was a requirement for reincarnation. Without forgetting, the psyche could not survive. Later, in Roman accounts, Lethe becomes a boundary between memory and non-being. The motif recurs across Indo-European mythologies. The soul is constantly threatened by forgetfulness, not because it is weak, but because memory is unstable. Entities who exploit that instability, who feed on the loss or manipulation of thought, represent an inversion of divine memory. They are not teachers, they are unlearners. In Gnostic cosmology, thought feeding becomes a metaphysical condition. The archons, false rulers who preside over a corrupted material world, sustain themselves not through worship, but through ignorance. As long as humanity remains unaware of the divine source, the pleroma, the archons maintain their power. The implication is radical. Clarity weakens them. But here we encounter a paradox that echoes throughout cosmic horror. Once a Gnostic awakens, the archons do not vanish, they intensify. This mirrors Lovecraftian logic. Understanding does not rescue the seeker, but renders them more visible. It is not ignorance that protects, but a kind of strategic incompleteness. Buddhist and Hindu traditions also provide precedents, though through different ontological models. In Tibetan Buddhism, Mara are forces that distract, seduce, or confuse the meditator. They are not beings in the Western sense, but manifestations of cognitive vulnerability. They arise when one seeks clarity. In Hindu cosmology, Maya refers to the veil of illusion that conceals true reality. Though not inherently malicious, Maya obscures. To remain enmeshed in it is to forget the self's nature. Some tantric interpretations treat certain asuras, anti-gods, as feeders on delusion itself. The implication is unsettling. Spiritual progress draws attention, and attention invites predation. Medieval Christian demonology reframes these concerns through moral absolutism. Demons in these texts are obsessed not only with temptation, but with madness. They whisper blasphemies, create hallucinations, and fragment the mind. What distinguishes them from later cosmic entities is their purpose. They seek to corrupt souls, not dismantle reason as such. But the techniques overlap: mental invasion, dream manipulation, compulsive thought. In this sense, they foreshadow later developments. The demon is still anthropocentric. It wants to win, but the horror begins to shift toward cognitive territory. Sin becomes confusion. Temptation becomes epistemic disarray. The Enlightenment did not eliminate these ideas. It displaced them. Fear of demonic possession transformed into fear of irrationality, and eventually of misperception. Cartesian doubt, Kant's unknowable noumenon, and Schopenhauer's blind will all describe a world in which perception is suspect. Nietzsche's abyss is not a place. It is a metaphor for reflexivity, for the moment when thinking becomes self-consuming. In each case, the philosopher touches something Lovecraft will later exploit: the realization that knowledge has limits, and that what lies beyond may not be hostile, but may still be destructive. Not evil, but unfiltered. Not immoral, but incompatible. We must acknowledge that these antecedents are not interchangeable. Gnostic archons are not Buddhist Maras, and the Lethe is not Maya. Yet the recurrence of certain motifs, forgetting, mental invasion, enforced illusion, suggests a cross-cultural intuition that thought is not sovereign. It can be manipulated, harvested, or undone. More importantly, the danger often arises when one seeks clarity. The act of seeking itself creates exposure. In this framework, thought feeding is not the crime of a hostile being. It is a systemic consequence of trying to see too much. This brings us to the present inquiry. Modern horror did not invent the feeding entity. It inherited and reconfigured it. In doing so, it stripped away the religious safeguards, divine intervention, karmic justice, sacred memory, and replaced them with indifference. What was once spiritual error becomes cognitive exposure. The next question is how language, etymology, metaphor, and symbol translates this ancient intuition into modern horror. The evolution of terminology reveals not only how we name these entities, but how they name us. Language shapes how cognitive predation can be imagined. Entities that feed on thought are rarely described through direct physical action. Instead, they are framed through verbs of transfer and depletion. Words such as feed, consume, drain, and harvest imply process rather than violence. This matters because process suggests continuity. A predator kills once. A feeder persists. The choice of language shifts the threat from an event to a condition. Thought is not taken in a moment. It is gradually rendered unusable. This linguistic pattern appears across mythic, religious, and literary traditions, indicating a shared intuition that cognition can be exhausted without visible injury. The metaphor of feeding is consistently paired with agricultural or parasitic imagery. Harvest implies planning, timing, and renewal. Parasites imply dependence without reciprocity. In Lovecraft's fiction, entities do not simply encounter minds, they await them. Yog-Sothoth knows where the old ones broke through, a phrase that collapses knowledge and location into a single function. To know is to be adjacent. Consider this carefully. The verb structures erase distance. Knowing becomes spatial proximity, and proximity becomes vulnerability. Language performs the same collapse that the narrative warns against. Names themselves often resist stability. Lovecraft deliberately constructed names that frustrate pronunciation. Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, not to exoticize, but to destabilize linguistic confidence. The reader cannot comfortably internalize the term. This produces a minor but persistent cognitive strain. Other authors follow a similar strategy without imitating the phonetics. Borges uses infinite catalogs and self-referential titles. Ligotti favors abstractions that behave like proper nouns. In each case, the name functions as a cognitive irritant. It occupies mental space without resolving into meaning. The symbol feeds simply by being recalled. Certain symbols recur with notable consistency. Eyes appear not as organs of vision, but as instruments of exposure. Libraries appear not as repositories of wisdom, but as labyrinths that exceed navigability. Dreams function as access points where symbolic order weakens. These images are not decorative. They indicate systems where information moves faster than comprehension. The library contains more than can be read. The eye sees more than can be processed. The dream admits connections that waking logic forbids. Each symbol encodes an imbalance between input and capacity. We must pause here to address vagueness. These entities are rarely described in full because precision would limit them. Vague description is not evasion. It is a representational strategy. When a text claims that a being is indescribable, it is not confessing failure. It is signaling that description itself is part of the feeding process. To define is to offer structure. To offer structure is to create something that can be entered, navigated, and exploited. Indeterminacy becomes a defensive posture, both for the author and the fictional universe. Etymology also reveals an important inversion. In classical usage, knowledge implies accumulation. In these texts, knowledge implies erosion. The more one knows, the less one retains coherence. This is not anti-knowledge, but anti-totality. The problem is not learning, but completion. Systems that promise total understanding, perfect, maps, final explanations, comprehensive theories, are consistently portrayed as traps. They invite a level of cognitive commitment that exceeds human limits. The feeder does not attack the ignorant. It waits for the convinced. Across languages, terms associated with madness reinforce this logic. The Greek mania originally indicated divine inspiration. The Latin insania suggests being outside oneself. In modern horror, madness becomes a technical state, partial alignment with an incompatible system. The individual does not lose reason. They acquire a surplus of it, directed toward a framework that cannot sustain human identity. This reveals something profound. Madness in this tradition is not the absence of meaning, but the presence of too much. Taken together, these linguistic patterns establish how thought-feeding entities operate at the level of representation. They do not need bodies because language provides one. They do not need mouths because symbols circulate. Once named, hinted at, or partially structured, they occupy cognitive space. The next step, then, is narrative. How stories themselves are engineered to feel discovered rather than invented determines whether these entities remain fictional or begin to feel disturbingly autonomous. Narratives about thought-feeding entities rarely unfold as linear tales. Instead, they adopt the structure of discovery, fragments, testimonials, footnotes, and discredited reports. This is not merely aesthetic. The fragmented form mimics the epistemic breakdown that such entities induce. A coherent story would imply containment. A scattered archive, by contrast, suggests something that resists synthesis. The horror does not lie in what is told, but in what the telling implies. That the narrative is incomplete because the subject is still active. The reader, like the narrator, has not escaped the system. They have entered it. Lovecraft refined this strategy with meticulous care. His stories often present themselves as recovered documents, survivor accounts, or scholarly reconstructions. The Call of Cthulhu begins not with an event, but with a warning. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This is more than preamble. It establishes the governing principle. To correlate is to invite collapse. The narrative must therefore remain partial. Each added detail brings the reader closer to an outline they cannot fully assemble. Horror emerges from the structure of almost understanding. This technique found fertile ground in post-Lovecraftian literature. Borges's Tlön, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius masquerades as a scholarly investigation into an invented encyclopedia. The effect is destabilizing. Fiction is treated as a discovery. So convincing is the form that some readers initially treated the story as a genuine historical mystery. The SCP Foundation, a contemporary online project, extends this logic. Thousands of user-submitted entries present anomalies using the language of scientific containment. Footnotes, redactions, and institutional jargon are used not for realism, but to produce a specific kind of dread, the sense that something has escaped the text. We must pause here to consider what this structure accomplishes. It turns the act of reading into participation. The reader is not merely observing events, but assembling knowledge, precisely the behavior that empowers the entity within the fiction. This is not a fourth wall break. It is a feedback loop. As the reader connects fragments, they reenact the same cognitive pattern that leads to collapse within the narrative. The story warns and invites in the same gesture. To understand the danger, one must enact it. The use of unreliable narrators, censored materials, and institutional suppression is not incidental. These techniques suggest that the full truth exists, but that accessing it causes damage. The absence of resolution mimics the trauma of forbidden knowledge, fragmented memory, contradictory perception, and obsessive return. In The Shadow Out of Time, Lovecraft's narrator cannot determine whether his visions were dreams, memories, or manipulations. His notes are incomplete, his conclusions ambiguous. The narrative withholds closure, not for suspense, but because closure would contradict the very premise, that the mind has limits, and those limits have been breached. What emerges is a style of horror that builds authenticity by undermining narrative authority. The more a story resembles a real document, a diary, a transcript, a field report, the more it implies that fiction is not invention, but filtration. This reverses the typical logic of genre. In most horror, disbelief is suspended. Here, disbelief is invited, and then methodically dismantled. The text behaves as though it has something to hide. That behavior becomes the story. The entity need not speak. The form of the telling is its voice. This raises a disturbing implication. If these narratives succeed by simulating discovery, and if the discovery itself constitutes exposure, then the reader has no stable ground. They are not protected by genre boundaries. The text has breached its fictional containment. It has passed itself off as partial truth, and by engaging with it, the reader accepts that condition. Thought-feeding entities, in this sense, are not characters. They are narrative consequences. They emerge when structure mimics system failure. They appear when coherence collapses under the pressure of too much data and not enough certainty. With this foundation in place, we now turn to the core philosophical concepts these entities embody. The stories may remain fragmented, but the ideas behind them cohere into a chilling proposition. That thought itself, when extended beyond its evolved purpose, becomes visible to things that should not notice us. The nature of those things and the themes they represent are the subject of Part 2. The heart of every story involving thought-feeding entities lies a philosophical proposition that the human mind is not the crown of evolution, but a brief, misaligned accident, useful, but not sovereign. Cosmic horror displaces anthropocentrism not only spatially, but cognitively. The terror is not that we are small, but that our very capacity to understand has made us legible to things that exist beyond context. This is not existentialism. It is post-existentialism. It asks what remains when meaning is not just absent, but irrelevant. The concept of insignificance in cosmic horror differs sharply from nihilism. Nihilism asserts that life lacks inherent meaning. Cosmic horror goes further. It suggests that meaning exists, but is hostile. In Lovecraft's fiction, entities such as Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth are not evil. They are indifferent mechanisms whose presence shatters our interpretive frameworks. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the narrator remarks that the human brain is a most delicate instrument, a line that carries no comfort. It implies fragility, not refinement. In this framing, cognition is less a gift than an open wound. The second principle, entropy, compounds this instability. These entities do not merely induce madness, they accelerate disorder. Entropy here is not limited to thermodynamics. It refers to informational entropy, the collapse of signal into noise, of order into incoherence. A mind exposed to unfiltered cosmic data begins to fray. Time loses linearity. Identity fragments. In the shadow, out of time, the protagonist's memories are displaced by those of another being, not through force, but through alignment. The mind is overwritten not violently, but naturally, as if it were never meant to be fixed in the first place. This entropy is recursive. The more one seeks to resist it, the more complex the cognitive structure becomes, and the more it unravels. Knowledge does not stabilize the self. It renders it more susceptible. This reverses Enlightenment assumptions. Traditionally, knowledge is redemptive. Here, it is combustible. The very act of understanding increases internal strain. The mind begins to simulate, then emulate, then echo the thing it attempts to know. At this point, thought becomes both medium and meal. The third concept, dream reality, provides a liminal space in which these breakdowns can occur without immediate contradiction. Dreams have long served as narrative laboratories for altered logic. In cosmic horror, they are more than metaphors. They are structural bridges between subjective perception and extrinsic intelligence. In the Call of Cthulhu, global dream disturbances presage the awakening of a submerged entity. Not visions, not prophecies, just noise. The implication is clear. Dreaming is not safe. It is a broadcast channel, and minds, especially human ones, are tuned to frequencies they do not understand. This aligns with broader metaphysical questions. If dreams are shared across cultures, can they be influenced externally? If symbols arise independently in disconnected minds, are they emergent or are they inserted? This is not idle speculation. Jung's theory of the collective unconscious was rooted in the idea that archetypes recur because the psyche is structured. Cosmic horror retools this. What if that structure makes us detectable? If patterns repeat, something might notice the pattern and use it as a point of entry. In this framework, dreams are not distortions. They are surveillance. Taken together, these three concepts form a coherent philosophical system. Insignificance strips away moral protection. Entropy dismantles cognitive stability, and dream reality removes spatial boundaries. Thought becomes fluid, and fluidity permits access. This access is not violent. It is ambient. That is the most disturbing implication. These entities do not breach the mind. The mind, through its own operations, calls them. Madness, then, is not infection, it is resonance. In the next section, we will examine what exactly is doing the feeding. But we must carry these principles forward. The entities themselves are not fully separate from the system they exploit. They do not act upon thought. They emerge from its limits. Their horror lies not in their shape, but in their function. They complete a process we were never meant to survive. To catalog thought-feeding entities is, by design, an incomplete task. These beings resist systematization, not only because they are fictional, but because they operate at the edges of fiction, often behaving like emergent phenomena rather than discrete characters. Yet patterns emerge. Across cosmic horror literature, certain entities recur not because they share a mythos, but because they fulfill a similar function: the consumption, distortion, or redirection of human cognition. They are not predators in a biological sense. They are structural anomalies that make consciousness unstable. The great old, ones particularly those in Lovecraft's mythos, offer the clearest literary blueprint. Cthulhu, for instance, does not speak, move, or act in traditional ways. His influence spreads through dreams, low-frequency signals that affect artists, mystics, and sensitives. He calls across time and culture, not with words, but with psychic pressure. In the Call of Cthulhu, the narrator observes that the dreams of sensitive men were filled with strange images, suggesting that Cthulhu's presence is not an act of will, but an effect of proximity. He does not feed on dreams directly. The dreams are leakage from a presence the human mind cannot fully exclude. Other old ones operate with more deliberate implications. Yog-Sothoth is described as the key and the gate, a being who is time and space. When contact occurs, it is rarely visual. It is cognitive. The mind touches something that reorders it permanently. In the Dunwich horror, Yog-Sothoth impregnates a mortal woman, producing offspring that exist partially outside normal dimensions. The horror is not the hybrid itself, but the mental disorientation that results when categories like inside and outside, now and later, cease to mean anything. Yog-Sothoth does not seek attention. Human attention simply activates his presence. Among the outer gods, Azathoth is perhaps the most abstract. He is a blind, idiot god, mindless and immense, surrounded by a chorus of piping flutes. The metaphor is deliberate. Azathoth is not malevolent, nor even aware. He is raw process, creation without cognition. To imagine Azathoth is to confront the idea that intelligence is not primary, but peripheral. In this context, thinking becomes anomaly. If the universe is fundamentally mindless, then thought itself becomes a flare, a deviation that might attract unwanted notice. Azathoth does not feed, but his very condition implies a world where thought is an accident with consequences. Nyarlathotep, by contrast, is a specificity incarnate. He speaks, travels, and seduces, but never as himself. He is a shapeshifter, a mask wearer. His horror lies in interpretation. He adopts forms that minds can accept: cult leader, scientist, bureaucrat, then bends cognition inward. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he manipulates Randolph Carter not through force, but through dream logic and contradiction. Nyarlathotep thrives on the collapse of categories. He feeds not on raw thought, but on misunderstanding, turning each mental framework into its own collapse vector. Where Yog-Sothoth is the gate, Nyarlathotep is the doorway mislabeled. Outside Lovecraft's direct mythos, dreamlands beings serve a complementary role. These are less codified and more fluid. They occupy the interstitial space between symbol and story, manticores that speak in riddles, zoogs that whisper in archives, gods that fade when named. Their power lies in the interruption of mental continuity. In dreams, time warps, identity wavers, and logic loops. Thought becomes nonlinear, and these beings exploit that drift. The dreamlands are not escape. They are exposure to a domain where cognition behaves differently, and where certain entities thrive in unresolved mental states. Contemporary cosmic horror expands the category further. In Thomas Ligotti's universe, no names are needed. The predators are conditions, awareness itself, or the creeping suspicion that consciousness is a disease. In The Last Feast of Harlequin, it is not a god that consumes the protagonist. It is the realization that identity was always a costume. In more recent fiction, such as Laird Barron's The Imago sequence, entities operate more like signals than beings, transmitted through photographs, voices, or stories that shift those who perceive them. Here, the idea of feeding becomes distributed. The entity is not elsewhere. It is already inside the system. What links all these figures is their functional similarity. They do not require faith, sacrifice, or even recognition. They operate through contact with structured attention. The more ordered the mind, the more vulnerable it becomes. These entities do not stalk the body. They distort the map. The self becomes a landscape they erode from within. In the next section, we will examine the human response to such contact, not through confrontation, but through madness, which in this tradition is not breakdown, but unwanted alignment. Madness, in cosmic horror, is not an interruption of reason. It is its logical conclusion under exposure. When human minds encounter entities that feed on thought, they do not merely break, they reconfigure. What appears to external observers as insanity is often the result of cognition adjusting itself to incompatible inputs. This reframes madness not as failure, but as maladaptive survival. The mind does not collapse arbitrarily. It changes shape in order to continue existing under conditions it was never designed to endure. The pattern of human interaction with these entities follows a recognizable arc: curiosity, obsession, revelation, dissolution. In the shadow. Out of time, the narrator begins by studying ancient civilizations and ends by realizing his consciousness was displaced across eons. The story does not show him screaming in a padded room. Instead, it ends with quiet terror. I shall never sleep calmly again. This is characteristic. Madness is not theatrical. It is lingering cognitive asymmetry. What he knows and what he can endure are now in conflict. Crucially, those most affected are not the weak-minded, but the intellectually attuned. Scholars, artists, dreamers, those whose mental architecture is built to detect patterns, are the most likely to notice the anomaly. Their skills make them vulnerable. In the Call of Cthulhu, it is sensitive intellectuals who receive the dreams. The cultists, by contrast, are barely affected. They serve, but they do not perceive. The message here is pointed. The horror is not reserved for the credulous. It is reserved for those who insist on making sense. Madness becomes the cost of interpretive effort. The idea that madness results from partial alignment with an alien logic recurs across the tradition. In Borges's The Zahir, obsession with a coin leads to epistemic annihilation. I am not sure that I still exist. In Ligotti's fiction, awareness itself is framed as a parasitic loop, consciousness looking at consciousness until the boundary between seer and seen dissolves. This mirrors cosmic horror's central danger, not physical contact, but cognitive mimicry. The mind that maps the other too precisely begins to reproduce its structures, and in doing so, loses its own. We must pause here to examine the institutional response. Often, madness in these stories is managed, not cured. Asylums, archives, and obscure academic departments serve not as solutions, but as containment systems. They house survivors, not for their safety, but for the world's. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the narrator concludes that certain knowledge must be buried, not because it is false, but because it is too accurate. The institution becomes an epistemic firewall. Madness, in this context, is not only a personal cost, it is a societal risk vector. There is also a recursive element. Those who survive exposure often become transmitters. They write down what they saw. They publish notes. They speak. The madness is no longer contained within a single mind. It spreads through language. In modern cosmic horror, especially internet-based horror, e.g. the SCP Foundation or creepypasta, this becomes literal. Stories are treated as contagions. Reading them is risky. Here, madness is reframed as a network effect. The more minds that receive the signal, the more powerful the entity becomes. The thought feeder is no longer a visitor. It is an emergent property of information itself. What emerges is a devastating implication. These entities do not inflict madness. They make themselves visible through it. The madness is not an effect. It is a medium. The human mind becomes a reflective surface that warps under alien light. In the next section, we will examine how forbidden knowledge functions as a cognitive accelerant, how it moves from idea to infection, and how the collapse it triggers is not an accident, but a structurally inevitable outcome of overexposure. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is not dangerous because it is secret, but because it is structurally incompatible with the human mind. What is forbidden is not access, it is containment. These ideas can be learned, but not held. The danger lies in the relationship between knowledge and cognition. Some truths are shaped in such a way that to comprehend them is to suffer collapse. This is not moral trespass. It is architectural failure. Thought becomes the wrong vessel for what it is invited in. This redefinition distinguishes cosmic horror from earlier traditions of taboo. In religious or mythic systems, forbidden knowledge usually leads to divine punishment. Eve, Prometheus, Faust. These are transgressions against order. In cosmic horror, there is no punishment. There is only consequence. The acquisition of certain knowledge destabilizes the mind not because it is evil, but because it was not designed for human use. In the Dunwich Horror, Wilbur Whateley seeks the Necronomicon not to destroy the world, but to understand his nature. His failure is not moral, but ontological. The text reveals too much of his origin, and he becomes a liability to his own kind. Certain vectors recur. Books are the most common. The Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Book of Eibon. These fictional grimoires do not curse the reader. They translate them. Page by page, the reader becomes aligned with a different conceptual structure. But other media also function: music, sculpture, mathematics. In the music of Eric, Zan, the titular character, plays a melody that holds something back, not through magic, but through tonal pattern. In the dreams in the witch house, geometry itself becomes a bridge. What these stories share is a central thesis. Format does not matter. Any structure that organizes cognition can be used to smuggle in the unacceptable. The result is epistemic collapse. This is not ignorance, but saturation. The mind, confronted with too much coherence or too much contradiction, loses the ability to maintain interpretive boundaries. Time folds, self blurs. Language becomes recursive. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist's memories are replaced, not erased, and he is left with a body of menacing impressions. This ambiguity, impressions, not facts, captures the essence of collapse. The mind continues functioning, but without access to certainty. Thought is no longer a tool. It is a medium of contamination. Modern formulations of this idea include information, hazards, concepts that cause harm simply by being understood. In 21st century horror, this framework becomes literal. Digital horror, ARGs, creepypasta, online mythologies treat text, image, and narrative as viral agents. In the SCP Foundation, certain anomalies cause madness when described. In Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, the very structure of the book alters reader perception. These examples are not just metafictional, they point to a larger anxiety. We no longer control how thought enters us. The mind has become permeable, and certain patterns function like open circuits. We must pause here to consider what this says about knowledge itself. The Enlightenment premise, that truth liberates, is destabilized. Cosmic horror proposes a counter-thesis. Some truths demand more than we can give. They erode the boundary between knower and known. Worse, they may not be truths about the world, but truths that restructure the world upon recognition. Forbidden knowledge is not a locked room. It is a door that once opened keeps expanding. The mind cannot shut it because the shape of the mind has changed. What follows is not clarity, but ongoing vulnerability. Those who learn too much do not die immediately. They linger. They write. They speak. They transmit. Forbidden knowledge, in this formulation, is not a static object. It is a self-replicating process. It behaves like a parasite, non-living until hosted. And once hosted, it uses cognition to sustain itself. In Part 3, we will trace how these ideas have manifested in literature, not only in the works of Lovecraft, but in the broader archive of texts that behave as if they are themselves contaminated. The idea that a mind could become food appears earlier than Lovecraft, though often in scattered or metaphorical forms. In The King in Yellow, 1895, Robert W. Chambers introduces a play that induces madness in all who read it. The text is not cursed in the traditional sense. It contains no hexes or spells, but operates through structural infection. In the story, The Repairer of Reputations, the narrator insists, "I cannot forget the King in Yellow. It is not by chance that I read it. I was born to read it." The statement reframes reading as fate and madness as alignment. The mind does not encounter the book, it completes it. Chambers stops short of naming a predator, but the effect, obsession, disintegration, revelation, echoes throughout the genre. Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, 1894, offers a clearer precursor to epistemic collapse. Here, knowledge is literally dangerous. The protagonist experiments with sensory expansion, lifting the veil between dimensions. The result is not death, but insanity and suicide among those exposed. The character Helen Vaughn, born of this experiment, exerts a cognitive pressure on those around her. She does not kill them, she is simply too real. One character observes, "She looked at me, and I saw the abyss." Machen constructs horror not around violence, but excess of perception. The mind is wounded not by physical contact, but by too much truth. These texts establish key patterns later refined by Lovecraft: the unreadable document, the unbearable perception, and the mind that breaks not from fear, but from exposure. Notably, none of these stories contain traditional monsters. Instead, they hint at structures of reality that resist containment. They do not name the entity that feeds, but imply its existence through effect. The reader never sees the predator. They see what it leaves behind: fractured thought, unfinished sentences, contradictory memory. The feeding is always indirect, always deniable. That subtlety is not a limitation, it is the mechanism. Edgar Allan Poe, though writing in a different mode, also contributes to this lineage. In the facts, in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, 1845, the subject of a mesmerism experiment remains conscious during physical death, begging for release. His final words, "For God's sake, quick, quick, put me to sleep," or "Quick, waken me, quick, I say to you that I am dead," render identity as an unresolved tension between mind and body. The horror lies not in death, but in cognitive suspension, awareness that cannot anchor itself. Poe's influence is structural rather than mythic, but essential nonetheless. He shows that consciousness can be trapped, and that this state is worse than annihilation. H.G. Wells also experiments with thought-based horror. In The Door in the Wall, 1906, the protagonist experiences visions of another world, beautiful, irrational, and persistent. The memory haunts him for life. What's striking is that no external entity is ever confirmed. Yet the protagonist deteriorates under the weight of longing for unreality. Thought itself becomes the trap. As he reflects, "I was too young then to understand what I know now, that memory is not always merciful." Here, the feeding is self-inflicted. The story anticipates the idea that mere perception of another reality can begin to consume the psyche. Connections among these authors are often indirect. Chambers read Poe, Lovecraft read Chambers and Machen. But more important than linear influence is the thematic convergence. Each of these writers intuited that the horror of the mind lies not in its fragility, but in its incomplete insulation. They dramatize what happens when perception becomes recursive, when the mind loops around something it cannot resolve. In this model, the entity is less a figure than a consequence, the symptom of exposure to an unstable ontology. These early appearances matter because they prove the idea did not begin with tentacled gods or dream transmissions. It began with cognitive overreach, with stories about characters who sought meaning and found a pressure their minds could not bear. Cosmic horror did not invent the thought feeder. It recognized it as a structure, one embedded in story itself. The next subsections will show how Lovecraft made this implicit structure explicit, how he moved from scattered impressions to full narrative mechanisms, without ever closing the system or explaining it away. If earlier authors suggested the idea of minds as consumable, Lovecraft formalized it into a narrative engine. His stories are not about monstrous events. They are about the breakdown of cognitive insulation, the slow, irreversible collapse of the barrier between thought and that which thought cannot house. Nowhere is this more clearly dramatized than in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, a story in which no one directly confronts the entity, and yet multiple characters are destroyed by its conceptual gravity. Cthulhu does not act. He leaks, and that leakage, across dreams, art, myth, is enough to destabilize the human mind. The structure of The Call of Cthulhu is deliberately documentary. The narrator compiles fragments, police reports, ship logs, personal journals, and archaeological findings. Each source reveals a partial encounter, never a full picture. The most revealing is the dream artist Wilcox, whose sculptures resemble creatures he has never seen, yet seems compelled to recreate. "I felt myself on the edge of the world," he reports, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. The phrasing is crucial. It is not the thing itself that harms. It is the nearness, the imaginative adjacency. This is feeding by proximity, not assault. The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, pushes this logic further. Here, the protagonist's consciousness is displaced across aeons by the great race of Yith, a species that preserves knowledge by exchanging minds with hosts from other epochs. The horror lies not in pain or abduction, but in cognitive substitution. The narrator returns with traces of non-human memory and sensory impressions that do not belong to his body. "I found myself unaccountably thinking of great cyclopean cities," he writes, "and of shadowy vistas beyond human ken." The Yith do not destroy the mind. They overwrite it, temporarily, but effectively, treating thought as a storage medium. Lovecraft's fiction is filled with such ontological intrusions. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, the Mygo extract human brains and store them in cylinders, enabling interstellar travel without bodily form. But the more disturbing element is not the extraction. It is that the brains remain conscious and communicative. The victim becomes a disembodied intellect, denied any sensory input beyond voice. Here, thought is not only consumable, it is portable. And more importantly, it can be used without its owner's consent. This dramatizes a core Lovecraftian anxiety. The self is not closed, and the boundaries between subject and system are permeable. We must pause to note how consistently these stories frame madness not as rupture, but as residual function. The mind continues working, just not correctly. In Dagon, 1919, the unnamed narrator is traumatized not by violence, but by having seen something so monstrous in its implications that I dare not dwell upon it. He is not killed. He writes. He remembers. He relives. Madness here is not destruction. It is looped processing, thought that cannot terminate because the object of thought resists resolution. The mind feeds itself to the event in perpetuity. Across these texts, Lovecraft avoids direct confrontation. Cthulhu rises, but only briefly. The Yithian city is discovered, then abandoned. The Migo appear in letters and brief encounters. The entities themselves do not occupy much narrative space. Instead, the after effects do. This is not reticence, it is strategy. Lovecraft is not describing beings. He is dramatizing what happens when thought becomes structurally visible to things that do not think as we do. Their presence reveals that thought is not safe inside the skull. It leaks. It echoes. It can be accessed. These stories formalize a pattern that becomes foundational for the genre. They suggest that the real horror is not the entity, but the conceptual availability of the entity. To name it, to visualize it, to imagine its parameters is already to begin alignment. Lovecraft's characters are not victims of curiosity. They are victims of recognition. In the next case study, we will see how later authors, drawing from this blueprint, move away from named mythologies and instead explore the conditions under which awareness itself becomes sustenance. Where Lovecraft introduced cognitive vulnerability through mythic scaffolding, later writers refined the concept by removing its mythological certainty. In their work, thought-feeding entities are no longer ancient gods or alien races. They are conditions, anomalies, or invisible systems. This shift reflects a deeper philosophical turn. Horror is no longer an encounter with the outside, but with the internal collapse of meaning itself. These stories no longer ask what is out there, but rather, what happens when we see too clearly what's already here? Thomas Ligotti's The Last Feast of Harlequin, 1990, exemplifies this evolution. At first glance, it is a story of folkloric investigation, a scholar researching a bizarre clown festival in a remote town. But the deeper horror lies in what the protagonist gradually comes to understand. The town is the site of an inhuman ritual cycle, and the revelers are not merely eccentric. They are biologically or metaphysically other. By the end, the narrator suspects that he himself is one of them. The story never shows feeding in a literal sense. Instead, it dramatizes the erosion of ontological distinction. The protagonist's thoughts betray him. Identity is not shattered, but absorbed into an alien template. Ligotti's entities are rarely named. That is the point. In The Shadow at the Bottom of the World, the town itself becomes infected by an abstract presence, seasonal, ambient, inevitable. People begin to act unnaturally, not under possession, but as if their cognitive functions have been repurposed. One character speaks of the thoughts that are not mine but pass through me like whispers in an empty house. This marks a key departure from Lovecraft. Here there is no mythos, no cosmic lineage. The horror is autonomous. It feeds by resonance, not recognition. Jorge Luis Borges, though not traditionally grouped with horror writers, also engages with the idea of conceptual predation. In Tlön, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius, 1940, the discovery of a fictional encyclopedia describing a fictitious world begins to alter reality itself. The characters do not descend into madness. They lose the distinction between fiction and perception. The world becomes Tlön because people begin to think as if Tlön were real. This is not feeding as attack. It is thought colonization. The story ends with resignation. The contact and the habit of Tlön have disintegrated this world. Borges imagines a form of cognition so persuasive that it replaces consensus reality. Laird Barron brings a different angle, cosmic horror entangled with crime, generational trauma, and the wilderness. In the Imago sequence, 2007, a series of photographs allegedly induces madness in viewers. The protagonist, a hard-edged investigator, gradually realizes that perception itself is not passive. The photographs do not depict anything concrete, yet they infect memory. He recalls things he never saw. I knew what came next, though I'd never seen it. The implication is clear. The act of seeing is the act of being seen. The entity, never described, is not separate from the image. It is embedded within the cognitive act itself. What unites these post-Lovecraftian variations is their functional minimalism. The entities are not dramatized. They are not explained. Their presence is inferred through systemic distortions, memory gaps, personality shifts, dream incursions. The horror is not that something is attacking thought. The horror is that thought becomes the means of its own undoing. This reflects a modern anxiety. In a world of digital echo chambers, algorithmic manipulation, and cognitive overload, the idea that perception can be compromised from within is no longer speculative. It is atmospheric. We must pause here to consider why these stories dispense with mythology. Lovecraft used myth to build distance. His beings were ancient, alien, and vast. But modern writers bring the threat closer. Ligotti's pessimism frames awareness as a malfunction. Borges treats language as a virus. Baron weaponizes media itself. In each case, the monster is not an intruder. It is a side effect of consciousness extending beyond its limits. These entities do not knock on the door. They are already in the wiring. In the next and final subsection of Part 3, we will explore how later authors, especially collaborators, imitators, and online creators, extend these mechanisms across media. As the mythos disperses, the structure of thought feeding becomes more adaptable, more modular, and more difficult to dismiss as fiction. What began as myth is now behaving like pattern recognition with consequences. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, his ideas did not vanish. They proliferated. The Cthulhu Mythos, though never formally systematized by Lovecraft himself, was codified and expanded by his literary executor and correspondent, August Derleth. Derleth attempted to organize Lovecraft's chaotic cosmology into a dualistic structure. Elder gods as benevolent, and great old ones as malevolent. This reconfiguration added moral structure to a mythos that was, at its core, indifferent. Derleth's system introduced clear categories and theological overtones, but in doing so, undermined the core philosophical horror that the universe has no interest in human meaning at all. Yet, even within Derleth's revisions, the logic of thought as vulnerability remains. In stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, Derleth maintains the idea of cognition as a pathway. The more one learns, the closer one comes to catastrophe. The structure of forbidden knowledge still drives the plot, but the implications are softened. Entities can be banished, evil can be named, and knowledge can sometimes be reversed. Lovecraft's ambiguous fatalism becomes, under Derleth, a manageable theology. Later writers would react strongly against this, stripping the mythos of its moral scaffolding and returning to its original cognitive threat. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, marked a turning point in the mythos's cultural dissemination. It introduced formal mechanics for mental degradation, a sanity statistic that decreases as players encounter truths too large for their minds to hold. Though the medium is interactive, the message is consistent with Lovecraftian. Logic, knowledge hurts. Encountering the unknown does not empower, it corrodes. The game formalizes epistemic risk as a measurable resource. Players are rewarded narratively for uncovering secrets, but punished mechanically. This paradox echoes the source material. The better you understand, the worse you fare. Online, the mythos has taken on a new, decentralized life. The SCP Foundation, an anonymous, crowdsourced fiction project, builds a shared universe around anomalies that defy scientific understanding. Many SCP entries feature cognitohazards, entities or objects that damage the human mind through comprehension. SCP-2316, for example, warns the reader repeatedly, "You do not recognize the bodies in the water." The phrase repeats, destabilizing perception. Other SCPs contain redacted data, forbidden symbols, or self-erasing language. These aren't monsters. They are information patterns that behave like infections. The reader becomes complicit simply by reading far enough. What distinguishes this phase of expansion is its modularity. The mythos is no longer a fixed pantheon of gods, but a grammar of cognitive dread. Anyone can write within it. Anyone can extend it. The structure is more important than the lore. The core elements, unbearable knowledge, recursive madness, ambient predation, are abstract enough to be applied across media. Podcasts, the Magnus Archives, digital ARGs, Local 58, experimental film, the Backrooms, and horror literature. The entity is no longer defined by name or form. It is defined by what it does to perception. We must pause here to consider the cultural function of this shift. As horror becomes participatory, the thought feeder becomes a distributed function rather than a discrete figure. It is not summoned. It is activated. It appears in the gap between what is seen and what can be believed. The story does not need to tell the reader they are vulnerable. It arranges symbols in such a way that the reader begins to feel that vulnerability. The entity exists because the structure supports it. This is not mimicry of Lovecraft. It is acceleration. In sum, the collaborative expansion of the mythos has moved cosmic horror from authored stories to emergent systems. Derleth tried to impose hierarchy. Games turned horror into rules. Online communities broke those rules open. But across each stage, the central function remains. Thought, once shaped in certain ways, becomes accessible. What was once myth has become a pattern recognition engine, and the question now is no longer what these entities are, but whether we are already part of their operation. In Part 4, we will examine how this pattern bleeds into culture, media, belief, and behavior, until the act of thinking about them becomes indistinguishable from feeding them. The boundary between fiction and reported experience is more porous than it appears. Stories of entities that feed on human thought have moved beyond literature and into the territory of urban legend, hoax, and claimed encounter. These manifestations do not always borrow Lovecraft's vocabulary, yet they replicate his structure, a presence that affects cognition, erodes memory, and alters perception, not through contact, but through attention. Once the idea exists, it begins to behave as if it were real. That behavioral realism matters. Belief is not always the cause. Sometimes it's the effect. Take, for example, the Slender Man phenomenon. Originating as a creepypasta image in 2009, Slender Man spread rapidly across forums, image boards, and YouTube horror series. He is often depicted as a tall, faceless figure who appears in the background of photographs, influencing dreams and compelling violent behavior. Crucially, he does not kill directly. He induces obsession, paranoia, and altered behavior. In 2014, Two 12-year-old girls in Wisconsin stabbed a classmate in what they described as an offering to Slender Man. The horror here is not the fictional character, but how easily the structure of cognitive feeding escaped the frame of fiction. It was never about belief. It was about thinking long enough to blur the boundary. UFO lore follows a similar trajectory. Reports of alien abduction often include features familiar from cosmic horror: paralysis, nonverbal communication, memory gaps, symbolic overload. The 1961 abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, for instance, includes dreamlike recollections, contradictory details, and an overwhelming sense of being observed by something not human, but curious. In many accounts, the entities are not hostile, merely functionally incompatible with human thought. The abductees return, altered, haunted less by trauma than by incomplete translation. The mind struggles not with what happened, but with what almost made sense. More recent internet hoaxes have adopted similar patterns. The Backrooms, a collaborative fiction project begun in 2019, describes a liminal space one enters by no clipping out of reality. Its vast, empty corridors are filled with flickering lights, damp carpet, and the hum of fluorescent bulbs. No single creature haunts the Backrooms. Instead, the environment itself degrades cognition. Time loses meaning. Space loops. Entities may or may not exist. The horror arises from being thought about by a place that does not fully exist, and the more detailed the community's additions become, the more real the structure begins to behave. The mind accepts it not because it is factual, but because it is functionally plausible. These phenomena persist because they exploit a basic human trait. Our brains are built for pattern recognition, even in absence of source. When gaps emerge in memory or experience, the mind fills them with narrative. The thought-feeding entity becomes a vessel for those narratives that resist closure. We turn unexplained anxiety, obsessive thoughts, or looping dreams into external figures, not out of superstition, but out of necessity. Something must hold the shape of the uncontainable, and in doing so, it feeds, not literally, but narratively. The more stories are told, the more persistent the figure becomes, behaving like a mimetic organism. We must pause to acknowledge that many of these encounters are not faked. They are reported sincerely by people who do not claim to have seen monsters, but who feel watched, drained, altered. Their language is often imprecise. It didn't look at me, but it noticed me. But their emotional structure aligns with cosmic horror's themes. There is fear, but also awe. There is confusion, but also a sense of patterned interference. Whether psychological, neurological, or cultural, the source of the phenomenon matters less than its form. These are not stories of physical harm. They are stories of cognitive trespass. The implication is unsettling. Thought-feeding entities do not require belief to function. They require only participation. Whether invented or experienced, they operate within a consistent grammar: suggestion, obsession, partial understanding, and mental erosion. That consistency is not proof of reality, but it is a sign of conceptual utility. These beings exist not outside us, but in the architectures of story, perception, and fear that we continually reconstruct. In the next subsection, we will examine how film, games, and music weaponize this grammar, turning media itself into a vector for narrative exposure, and perhaps for something older still. Mainstream media adaptations rarely recreate the philosophical depth of cosmic horror's literary roots, but they often excel at replicating its structure: suggestion over revelation, disorientation over action, and most importantly, a sense that consciousness itself is being manipulated. When adapted effectively, film, games, and music do not merely represent entities that feed on thought. They replicate the experience of having one's perceptions subtly rewritten. The audience becomes a participant, not in violence, but in cognitive erosion. In film, this is most evident in works that eschew visible monsters for ambient dread and epistemic instability. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, is a direct meditation on the mechanics of fictional infection. The protagonist investigates a horror novelist whose books are causing readers to lose their minds. As the film progresses, reality begins to mirror the novels, until it becomes impossible to say whether the world is collapsing or merely being rewritten by belief. The closing scene, in which the protagonist watches a film of the events we've just seen, starring himself, collapses fiction, audience, and identity into a recursive loop. Thought is not only consumed, it is replaced. Video games as interactive media go further. Titles like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, and Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, incorporate sanity mechanics where visual distortions, auditory hallucinations, and memory loss occur in response to exposure. These aren't cosmetic. They alter gameplay. Players miss cues, misread environments, become unable to distinguish threat from illusion. Horror here is not delivered through jump scares, but through cognitive sabotage. The game does not kill the character. It erodes the player's ability to trust their perception. The line between virtual and real disorientation becomes blurry by design. More recently, Control, 2019, and The Stanley Parable, 2013, build narratives where language, architecture, and logic are unreliable, mimicking the effect of thinking in a world where some background system has gone wrong. The player is not punished for curiosity, but punished for accumulating meaning. Every new answer generates more instability. These games embody the same logic as cosmic thought feeders. The more you understand, the less secure your cognition becomes. Knowledge is a maze, not a map. Music provides a less obvious, but still potent, medium for thought-affecting structures. In dark ambient and drone genres, particularly the works of artists like Lustmord, the Haxan Cloak, or Mount Eerie, composition emphasizes spatial disorientation, unresolved progression, and sub-bass frequencies that can be physically felt but not easily located. The result is not terror, but cognitive pressure. The listener cannot follow a melody or anticipate a climax. Instead, they inhabit a sound that resists form. Ligotti once wrote that music is the most cosmic of the arts, and in this case, the cosmos does not sing. It resonates without key or rhythm. These media succeed not by showing the thought feeder, but by behaving like one. They distort perception, punish coherence, and draw the audience into cycles of partial understanding. What was once confined to narrative has become experiential structure. That transition is significant. When the medium becomes the message, and the message is, you cannot trust your mind, the audience is no longer protected by genre boundaries. They are not watching horror. They are enacting its function. We must consider what this shift suggests about cultural appetite. That audiences seek out experiences of disorientation, willingly, even enthusiastically, implies more than thrill-seeking. It may signal a kind of adaptive rehearsal, testing how it feels to lose epistemic certainty in controlled conditions. If so, then these works are not escapes from reality. They are preparations for a world increasingly shaped by cognitive instability, misinformation, and psychological fragmentation. Horror, in this reading, does not predict the monster. It predicts the condition. As we move into an era where perception is constantly mediated, filtered, and manipulated, these adaptations take on a different weight. The thought feeder, once a metaphor for alien intrusion, now mirrors the systems we already inhabit. And the question lingers: if media can reproduce the conditions of cognitive erosion, intentionally or not, then how long before the entity we imagine becomes indistinguishable from the medium itself? In the next section, we'll explore how this logic has been embraced by subcultures, academic discourse, and online communities, not as fiction, but as framework. As cosmic horror disperses beyond its literary origins, it is no longer treated solely as a genre, but increasingly as a framework, a way of thinking about the world, not merely storytelling within it. Online subcultures and academic discourse have absorbed the idea of thought-feeding entities not as fictional monsters, but as conceptual tools for describing modern life. In these spaces, the horror is not something to fear, but something to study, map, and even adopt. The monster becomes metaphor, method, or even meme, but its function remains the same: to mark the moment when cognition turns against itself. Within subcultures, this manifests as deliberate ambiguity between irony and sincerity. Internet communities on platforms like Reddit, 4chan, and Discord play with the idea that fictional entities, such as SCP anomalies or backrooms beings, might be real if enough people think about them correctly. This is not belief in the supernatural. It is participation in an ontological game, where reality becomes elastic under communal attention. One user's phrase captures the mood: "We don't believe it's real. We behave as if it might be, just in case." In this context, the entity is not a deity or monster. It is a shared hallucination that knows it is shared, and grows stronger through repetition. Cosmic horror has also infiltrated philosophy, especially via the school of speculative realism. Thinkers like Eugene Thacker, Reza Negarestani, and Ray Brassier use horror fiction as a way to interrogate the limits of human-centered thinking. Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, frames horror as the moment when the world becomes unthinkable, yet still present. He writes, "Horror is about the paradox of a world that is both impersonal and horrific, intimate and indifferent. The thought feeder becomes a stand-in for non-anthropocentric cognition, a mode of intelligence that does not need us to exist, yet warps our minds when we try to interface with it." In literature departments, Lovecraft, once dismissed as pulp, is now studied seriously for what his work reveals about epistemic instability. Scholarly essays trace how his unreliable narrators, fragmented texts, and recursive structures anticipate postmodern concerns: the failure of grand narratives, the unreliability of perception, and the construction of identity through language. The thought-feeding entity, in this context, becomes a literary symptom of modern consciousness, grappling with its own breakdown. The horror is no longer about monsters in space. It is about the fragility of interpretation itself. We must pause here to consider the risk embedded in this trend. As horror becomes conceptualized, there is a temptation to treat it as pure metaphor, safe, domesticated, academic. But the best stories resist this flattening. They imply that thinking too long about these entities is dangerously close to thinking with them. This is not superstition. It is structural caution. The more we integrate cognitive horror into our theories of language, media, or politics, the more we must ask, are we describing a fiction, or are we refining the entity's mechanism? In certain corners of digital culture, this ambiguity becomes performative. ARG creators, online horror writers, and meta-narrative YouTube channels deliberately blur the line between artifact and commentary. A fictional document appears in a real academic format. A horror podcast presents itself as a recovered archive. The goal is not deception, it is complicity. The audience is invited not just to listen or read, but to help build the infrastructure through which the thought feeder moves. This is not play acting. It is distributed authorship functioning as distributed exposure. Ultimately, what these appropriations reveal is that the idea of a thought-feeding entity persists not because people believe in it, but because it describes something we already suspect, that in the modern world, our minds are not sealed systems. We are constantly acted upon by media, by narratives, by unseen algorithms, and we rarely know where our thoughts originate. The thought feeder becomes a figure that names this condition without resolving it. In the final section, we will return to this ambiguity, exploring why the entity's implications cannot be dismissed, and what it means to live in a world where thinking may already be a form of offering. Cosmic horror endures not because it offers monsters, but because it frames a question we cannot stop asking. What if thinking is not neutral? The idea that thought could be noticed, manipulated, or consumed challenges the bedrock of human autonomy. In most philosophical traditions, cognition is treated as the last safe domain, private, self-directed, sovereign. But the recurring figure of the thought-feeding entity forces us to reconsider. What if the mind is not a fortress, but a field, one visible to forces we do not understand and never invited? This inversion reappears across disciplines. In cognitive science, there is growing recognition that consciousness is modular, error-prone, and deeply influenced by external stimuli. Attention is shaped by architecture, memory by narrative, and emotion by language. If the self is a feedback loop, a narrative we rehearse under shifting internal pressures, then the boundary between internal and external influence becomes porous. Cosmic horror dramatizes this not as a scientific insight, but as a phenomenological threat. What we call my thoughts may already be compromised, not by intention, but by structure. The persistence of this idea mirrors contemporary anxieties. In an era of algorithmic surveillance, targeted advertising, and behavioral nudging, the concept of minds being fed upon no longer sounds fantastical. Entities are no longer required. Systems suffice. Social media does not think, but it reshapes thought. Attention is quantified, weaponized, and redistributed. The feed is not metaphor. It is mechanical reality. One does not need to posit a Lovecraftian god to believe that thinking can be harvested. The old gods are not dead. They've been reinterpreted as platforms, protocols, and patterns of interaction. We must pause here to consider the psychological resonance. The idea of a mind invaded or overwritten taps into fears of identity loss, derealization, and cognitive instability. But unlike traditional horror, cosmic horror offers no catharsis. There is no final scream, no monster to kill, only the creeping realization that you have been misinterpreting yourself, and that the parts you called you were only ever interpretations to begin with. Madness, in this model, is not deviance. It is overexposure to a structure that was never designed for human cognition. This implication is not necessarily bleak. It can be read instead as a form of radical humility. Cosmic horror invites us to consider that intelligence, ours or otherwise, is not inherently stabilizing. It may be anomalous. It may even be dangerous. but it is also shared. The moment we admit that cognition is a system, not a possession, we are no longer its only inhabitants. The thought-feeding entity, whether myth, metaphor, or mechanism, becomes a reminder that minds are never closed loops. They are always in relation to language, to memory, to others, and perhaps to something far older. This is why the idea persists, not because it explains anything, but because it cannot be entirely dismissed. Fiction behaves like speculation. Speculation becomes structure, and once a structure starts producing coherent unease, it is no longer inert. Whether or not such entities exist is no longer the most relevant question. The more important question is this: why does this pattern of horror keep functioning so effectively across forms, cultures, and decades? And what does that say about us? We leave that question open, not as a cliffhanger, but as a condition. Thought-feeding entities are not waiting in the dark. They are encoded in what we search for, what we remember, what we repeat. If they exist, they do so not despite us, but through us. We think, therefore they are.